Did you know that your hard hat doesn't last forever and should be replaced every 6 months to 2 years? If you were not aware, I recommend you watch this entire video. Hi, I'm Jimmy Moore from American Directional Driller. In today's safety meeting, we're going to discuss hard hats. Let me open this up. It's a really sharp looking hard hat I picked up off Amazon.com. Looks like carbon fiber. Looking at this hard hat, you'll notice that there's a clear back and a clear front. On this one, the front looks like a V, all right? So flipping it over, you'll see that there's 4 insertion points for your chassis suspension, and you'll also notice there's a clock. And we'll talk about this clock a little bit later. But right now, the top clock says 2, the bottom clock says 18, and that's a date. This hard hat was molded on February 2018. All right, so let's discuss this thing here called the suspension. You'll notice that there's some straps, the insertion points, there's an adjustment so I can tighten it and loosen it depending on the size of my head. And you'll also notice it's got a sweatband in the front and it's very clean. So how does the suspension on a hard hat work? Well, the suspension goes over your head, and then the hard hat, upon impact, works like a seatbelt. It's an impulse device. It extends the time between when an object, a hammer, falls and hits the top of your shell and pushes on your hard hat. Hopefully, the hard hat does not actually impact your head. Of course, hard hats are only effective for impacts from above. They're not effective for oblique impacts. So you'll notice that there's these little tabs here on the side, and those tabs go inside the bottom of the shell. So let's install that now. Should be pretty obvious. The sweatband goes in the front, and the adjustment goes in the back. So pick up my shell, make sure I know where the front is, and then I insert the tabs. Push them all the way in. All right, so now I'm going to put my hard hat on. And you notice this hard hat has an adjustment in the back that allows it to swing. So I put it on the top, I swing it around in the back underneath, and I tighten it. Now this hard hat is on pretty tight. And if I push on the top, it doesn't actually make contact with my head. So for me, there's one thing that's missing from this hard hat, and I'll do that step next. All right, so now I'm happy I have my new favorite sticker on my new favorite hard hat. Everybody that's been on a drilling rig knows at the beginning of your shift, you go to a half-hour safety meeting, and then every time you do something dangerous, you have another safety meeting. For most companies today, and especially the big operators, you usually do a job safety assessment before any task, and it needs to be signed off by someone like a safety captain. In some rigs, you have a safety captain for the night shift, and you have a safety captain for the day shift. All right, so let's talk about the details of hard hats. Hard hats comply with ANSI Z89, and that's a regulation set by OSHA. If you don't know what OSHA is, you probably haven't worked on an oil rig because it's something that's talked about every day. What did people use to protect their heads before the modern hard hat was invented? Well, some people claim that in shipyards, workers would take a hat, cover it with pitch and tar, let it bake in the sun. I wasn't around back then, so I can't say for sure if that's true, but it seems reasonable that that would afford you more protection than not having a hat at all. If you look on OSHA's database, you can see some pretty gruesome statistics about how people die. And I actually don't recommend you go look at this information, for example, before you go to bed. Why am I wearing a new hard hat today? Well, I noticed that my old hard hat had a clock that was just about 2 years old. So I looked up the manufacturer recommendations for that specific hard hat. They recommended that at about 2 years you should retire your hard hat. So many manufacturers have different recommendations, but in general, usually they'll say minimum 6 months, maximum 5 years. But the target for replacing the shell should be 2 years. The target for replacing the suspension should be done every year. Now, if you're a rig floor hand and you're getting covered with oil-based mud all day, and maybe you're out in the sun in Texas, it's probably a good idea to replace your hard hat every 6 months because chemicals and sunlight are known to degrade the hard hat plastic. At some point in your career, someone in your corporation is going to try to tell you that you can't use stickers on your hard hat. Well, it's not actually an OSHA regulation, and if you don't believe me, you can look it up on Google. There's a discussion about why stickers shouldn't be used, but it's not actually a hard and fast rule. The reason why stickers shouldn't be used is the same reason why you should wash your hard hat with mild detergent every day. If you can't see the tiny cracks in your hard hat, then you don't know when it's time to retire that hard hat. You might be wondering why I was compelled to make this safety video about something as simple as a hard hat. Well, something happened several years ago when I was a directional drilling coordinator that really affected me personally, and I started circulating safety material about hard hat inspections and when they expire, their useful life, around the company so that everyone knew about it. What I realized was that almost everyone that I came across had no idea that a hard hat had a useful life and needed to be replaced periodically. So what happened? Many years ago, there was a floor hand, was working on the rig, and someone didn't count the bolts properly up and down on the top drive surface. One of the bolts fell, fractured the hard hat, fractured the person's skull, and splattered some of their brain material on the drilling floor. It was an awful, awful incident, and I felt so terrible about what happened even though I didn't have any direct responsibility. I felt compelled to help others in my company try to avoid the same situation. So I started making PowerPoints as my safety minute before presentations where I would tell people, hey, did you know that you have to replace your hard hat every 6 months to 2 years? And almost no one knew what I was talking about. What I realized was this was a really important topic because just like the EULA agreements that you agree to when you go on the internet, no one's actually reading the replacement specifications from the hard hat manufacturer. What does OSHA stand for? OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's a federal agency meant to protect you and create safe working environments. Don't think of it as a hassle. Think of it as something that allows you to go home at the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of the job and see your family. None of the money is worth it if you can't go home. So you can't take the money with you when you're dead. There's oil fields all over the United States. And one thing to be careful of is that when you travel to a new state, you need to make sure that you understand there are state-specific OSHA organizations. They sometimes have rules that are more strict than the federal OSHA agency. I have personally worked on drilling rigs in 10 different states. In each of those states, they had different OSHA regulations, and it was important for me to go to the safety meetings every day, be on time, make sure that I listened. Because even if I had a lot of experience in my mind, I didn't always know what the rules were in Arkansas, California, New Mexico, Pennsylvania. These places are very different. When you're drilling in southwestern Pennsylvania above a coal mine, it's a very different safety environment than when you're drilling in North Dakota dealing with extreme cold. If you find yourself headed to the Bakken in North Dakota, make sure you pick up a few items before you get there. You're going to want to get a chin strap because your hard hat's probably going to blow off when the wind blows 100 miles an hour. Another thing I guarantee that you're going to need is a hard hat liner that's fire retardant. You'll need this to make sure that you don't get frostbite and lose your ears. The hard hat liners are basically something that you attach to the suspension. So you have to remove the suspension from your hard hat, install the hard hat liner, and then reinstall the suspension in the shell. It's a good time to do an inspection of all your equipment and maybe replace the suspension of your hard hat, especially if it's a year old. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people put objects inside their hard hat. Objects like a cell phone. Cell phones are really hard and they have batteries, for example. You have a falling object, let's say it's 10 pounds, and it has a certain momentum as it's falling. It impacts your hard hat, and then your hard hat has a gap. You want to have the largest gap possible between your head and the hard hat. If you decrease the gap, you reduce the amount of time with which the momentum is reduced. The momentum needs to go from some value to 0. The longer that time is, the more likely you are to survive the impact of a falling object. If the falling object falls and the gap is very small, you're much more likely to have a severe head injury. A lot of people will try to wear a baseball cap under their hard hat. This is a terrible idea for the same reasons we just discussed with falling objects. The baseball cap has that metal button at the top. Well, if a falling object falls and compresses the gap between your hard hat and the suspension, and it taps on that metal part, it's going to press your head. And hopefully it doesn't press into your head. Okay, so final note. I can remember in 2008 when I finally took off my green hard hat. Well, I was preoccupied with the thought that people wearing green hats were going to endanger my life. And what I realized was that the people wearing green hats had no idea where to stand when there was an object being lifted. They had no idea what they were doing. So really, the people wearing green hats needed the expertise of people with more seniority to help make sure that they didn't get hurt. So I implore everyone that's watched this entire video, make it your responsibility to look out for the safety and well-being of others, because someone watched out for you when you first got started. Pass it on. One final note, this is not legal or professional advice on hard hats. Please consult the hard hat manufacturer's recommendations about how to use, clean, and wear your hard hats. The term is don, how to don your PPE. Well, don't rely on me to give you advice on how to don your PPE, because PPE varies by manufacturer. You also need to make sure that you're abiding by rules that are specific to your location, to your state, to your city. Thanks again for choosing American Directional Driller's YouTube channel to learn about hard hat safety. We appreciate all the likes, all the comments, and all the subscriptions we get from our viewers. It would really mean a lot to me if everyone who's watched this video would go share this information with other people. And by that I mean you don't need to make everybody watch this video, but please let people know their hard hats can expire and they need to be replaced periodically. If everyone had a functioning hard hat that was within its useful life, we could reduce the amount of head injuries on the rigs. Thanks and have a great day.